everyone. We are talking about applique now, all the different types of applique, and then I'm also going to introduce you a little bit to how I do my applique. There are vast amounts of period applique available. If you are interested to see some of them, there is actually a group on Facebook called Historic Applique, and you're welcome to join the group. And within the group, or in the group, I have uploaded more than 350 examples of period applique. So that will give you a pretty good example, or a pretty good overview of all what is available. Okay, so we're going to start by sharing my screen again as soon as I remember how. Okay, let's start talking about applique. This is an overview of the different types of applique, the materials used, and possible ways of how it could have been done pre-1650. A few notes, as Stacy says, we will be recording the class. If you don't want your face to be recorded, please just switch off your camera. So in appliques, you can imagine all the time that I'm saying mostly, because applique is like the English language. There are more exceptions than rules. Anything I said to you, oh, they did it like this, and then they didn't. So most of the photos you see will be from museum websites, and I've noted what museums, or they were taken by me. And as I said, please visit the Facebook group called Historic Applique for lots and lots and lots of examples. And I've actually changed that. So by the time this goes out, that note will have changed. Okay, so there are many, many different types of applique. The three main ones is applied appliques, Intarsia applique, and reverse applique. So within these groups, there are subgroups. So the first group that we find is the applique that is applied applique that is non-hemmed. So for felted leather and felted leather, yeah, good luck with that. For felted wool and leather, they don't fray, so you don't actually have to worry about the edges of your applique. So for felted leather and felted wool and leather, generally what happened is they just cut out the design out of the piece that they were going to apply, stuck it on top, and sewed it down. Nothing more required. If you were working with linen and cotton, then you had to deal with the fabric fraying, and then you would need to do a hemmed application. Hemmed application basically means that they put the edges in between the layers, flipped it under and put the edges in between the layers. Now, just to make everything really, really exciting, when they worked with silks and velvets, which frays even more than linen and cotton does, they didn't usually do it as hemmed. What they did is they glued it down and then sewed it down. And the one thought is just that it is because of cost. For the velvets, it's also because of the thickness, because when you have folding velvet under, you start to work with some really serious thicknesses. So we have a lot of period examples of silks and velvets that are appliqued down that actually isn't hemmed. It doesn't have the edges folded under, there's a lot of examples of it where they can even tell you what type of glue was used. They were glued down. And there's also other examples where they just use starch. I actually, when I work with starch, with silks, I use starch a lot because then the silk becomes almost more like the paper, and it doesn't do the crazy floof fraying that you often get with silks. Our second type of applique is Intarsia. And what Intarsia means is that the fabric was almost used like a puzzle. So what they did is that they would cut two pieces out, and then they would switch them out, and then they would sew them together so that you start with two pieces of fabric, you end with two pieces of fabric, but they now have a pattern. And this actually gives us a very, very good example of that. If you look at this top right-hand horse and the bottom right-hand horse, it's the same horse, except that's the red on the black and that's the black on the red. And that is how Intarsia works. You cut the little horse out there, you cut the little horse out there, you swap them out, and now you have two pieces with a pattern for still the same amount of fabric. And if you want, you can play mahjong with this one and match all the tiles up, because they do. Each of them have the red on black and the black on red. So they all totally match up. Now, if we do Intarsia applique with silk and with hemmed, then we get quilting or piecework. Most of the examples, or all of the examples that I've seen with this, has been very simple geometric shape. There isn't really crazy shape examples with cotton, linen, and silk that are like fitted together like this and hemmed together like that. It's mostly squares, diamonds, or just a mismatch of things. Reverse applique. Reverse applique is like one of those weird things. When I first started playing STA 20 years ago and started getting into applique, I was told, oh my God, in period they used reverse applique all the time. And then when I started doing my research, I couldn't find any examples of it. Because what reverse applique actually is you put the top piece down, you sew it down, and then you cut the back out. And they're just, I am not sure if it is misnaming for Intarsia applique, or it is a reference to cutaway and slashed works. But if you look at older text and older booklets from the SCA, they talk about reverse applique, and I just don't know what it is. Now, there is modern reverse applique that you can find. I just haven't found it in period. The other thing that people point out to me all the time is that slips really is applique. Slips are usually canvas that is embroidered and then cut out and then applied onto a different fabric. I have a few examples generally of slips available, just because to acknowledge that they exist. But if you want to know more about making slips then I recommend you spend a bit more time with embroidery rather than applique, because there really is just so much of it that it would drown out all the other applique examples that do exist. These two amuse me though, because it makes me wonder, the fact that they're exactly the same makes me wonder if you could go to a studio and order, oh, I want 10 copies of my device, please, and they would make it up for you, and like patches. So okay, then also when we talk about applique, it's really difficult to search for applique on museum websites, because in many languages, applique and applied are like the same. So they will give you a lot of examples of embroidered trims and stuff like that, which true is applied, but we are not going to talk about that much, because then the bits I am really interested in will just get totally lost in the chatter. Okay, so the second thing about applique, we have the two examples. We have applied and we have intarsia. And the second thing that comes up is then the edges. A lot of them, but not all of them, of applique examples have the edges finished. And almost all of them, there's 3 exceptions, have the edges finished by couching. Couching some type of cord or various different types of cords onto the edge. You can see here with this one small little example, we have the applique, we have the couch cords. There's blue cording, there's yellow cording, there's blue and yellow combined cording, there's white cording, there's lots and lots of different cording. So the couching is kind of almost another level of design for this. And even more so, since not only is the outlines highlighted with couching, the couching is also continue on as a design of its own. And we see this very, very commonly. What's really interesting here is if you look at the central little yellow one, the couching is actually not right on the edge. It's actually offset from the edge. And that's very interesting and very unusual, because actually you want the couching right on the edge, because it kind of squishes the edge down and makes it more secure. We see a lot of couching that is gold work, silver work and stuff. Obviously, you want to couch those down. You don't want to try to sew. Anybody that's ever tried to work with like gold work and actually try to sew with it, you know, it just goes floof and explode. This is a very interesting example, because the couching cord on this is actually a metal thread, the type of metal thread that's very similar to what you would get when you are doing posaments, like a little, like the tight spiraled metal thread. That's what they did on this shoe. And there's a pair of boots that was done the same, where the couching was applied through as like a little, so really anything could be the couching. When I say anything, there's a lot of examples like this where the couched edge is done with gilded leather, leather that they literally put gold leaf on in these thin little strips and then sew down. And honestly, it couldn't have been fun. Like making even thin leather do this corner. I would be speaking in languages, several of them. So when people ask me about couching, my answer is usually just yes. What you can imagine, yes, that's what they did with couching. So here you can see an example where some of it has couching and some of it doesn't. And it might be that the bits that doesn't have couching had them previously, but there are examples from this same time period and same region where there's no couching whatsoever. So it could have been, it could not have been. This central cup here has wool, has the wool yarn that was couched down. This divide between the yellow or the white and the blue actually has a cotton cord that was couched down there that is like literally just like kitchen yarn, kitchen cord, you know, the twine that you would use to tie up a package type of that's almost exactly the same thickness and the same type of feel that you get from for this cording. So I think it's funny, so I actually use it all the time. And because this is from Egypt, that there's actually a good chance that it is cotton. Anywhere else, it probably wasn't cotton, but in Egypt, there are quite a few examples where this is, the twine actually is cotton. So yeah, within this one small little piece, we have Intarsia right there because they just fit together and they're sewn there. We have applied, we have couching, we have no couching, we have wool, and we have cotton. There's, you know, that is the joy of doing applique. You can use whatever you have. It's a great way to use up scraps. Okay, so the color of the couching. With this example, we saw that the color could be absolutely any color. Here we have a very good example where we have two different colors. This one have the details picked out by the white, and this one has the details picked up by the red. I'm also showing this example because the couching is actually doubled up. Each of these lines is actually a double line of couching. And the reason why they do that is because you get the visual thickness of it without getting the physical like height of it. It doesn't stick up so much while still being visually much more commanding. And then still talking about couching, the thread that was used to sew down the couching doesn't always match the color of the actual couching. So here we have the cord is white, but the thread used to sew it down is red, and it gives us almost like a dotted design. And but this is also a good example of how the couching was done, because, you know, it being different colors, it just show, you can so clearly see that it's done basically parallel with the, not parallel, perpendicular with the cording, like going straight across, and then it would angle at the back and go straight across as well. There is also examples where you can't see the sewed down bits at all, and that is because they worked it with the twist. So if you sew in the same direction as the twist is on the angle, your thread like naturally will fall into the little valleys made by the twist, and you can't see the thread. So for some of them, the thread is quite clear. That they used for the couching is very, very clear, and you can almost get this like dotted visual, and for some of them you just can't see it at all, and for those they have worked it at an angle following the twist of your thread that you're using. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the three examples that we do have of it not being couching. This tiny little scrap, so like my favorite piece of period scrap in the world, because the outline of this is actually done with chain stitch. And it is the only example that I have of the outline of applique being done with chain stitch. The reason why I like it is, number one, when I started doing applique, I did it for clothing for kids. Clothing, kids, and couching is an accident waiting to happen. It takes them about 10 seconds to hook it and just crumple the whole thing up. It's just crazy. So I started doing chain stitch, and somehow they don't catch that. I don't get it. How it's possible that that doesn't get caught. What I do love about it as well is that doing the chain stitch outline, you get an extremely thick line, and this is actually an example that I've done, and you can see here with the orange the very, very thick line that you can get with the chain stitch. So that's my one exception where the outline is done with chain stitch. The second outline happens when you work with leather. With leather, they did a running stitch to kind of sew it down, but also if you really look at it, where there's bigger parts of the leather, the running stitch outlines the bigger part of the leather, sometimes like a double row of running stitch and double row of double running stitch. So you'll often have like a single row where it's like thinner and then a double row following the shape of thicker parts. So with leather, we do get the running stitch as well. I haven't seen a running stitch or a double running stitch or anything like that for anything but leather. The third example is basically satin stitch. I often get asked if it isn't buttonhole stitch. I don't think so. Unfortunately, this is one of those examples where these are the two photos available of this thing, and I cannot find any other. But looking at it in detail, it doesn't have the when you do a real buttonhole stitch, it has like a linked element, and this doesn't. It's just like literally just satin stitched down. So I always get asked, how about blanket stitch? Because modernly, when we do applique, we use blanket stitch. I have not found it. I have looked at like literally more than 350 examples and never found an example of blanket stitch. So unfortunately, just cannot prove that it was done in period. If you're gonna do anything that people might comment about it, just stick to the couching, unfortunately. No examples of blanket stitch yet. But if you find it, let me know first. I would love to be able to change this class and go, look, I found it. But unfortunately, I have just not yet. Okay, so what is applique used for? Like everything. There are so many examples of different appliques, like bed covers, horse covers, cloaks, caps, shoes, saddles, chairs, canteens, you name it, they appliqued it. In fact, the entire inside of this tent is applique. So they actually worked all of those panels in layers of applique. So unlike my previous class, I can tell you they definitely used applique to decorate clothing. And here is a very clear example. And what's very clear about this example is that the garment was made first, and then the decoration was added to it. So you can see it goes right across where all the seams are. It actually was designed to turn the corner. So you can definitely make your dress first and then totally bling it up with some amazing applique. And there is more examples of them available as well. If you want to get silly, these boots are actually done in Intarsia. So these little panels of the design, the leather there, fits together like a puzzle and then was sewn together like a puzzle. These people knew what they were doing. I can tell you that. Not easy. Okay, let's talk a bit about materials. Wool, lots and lots and lots of applique wool. Wool is just natural for appliquing because it doesn't fray. So you can just put it right on top and sew it down. This is actually wool felt, not woven wool. But as you've seen in a previous example, there's definitely woven wool that was then felted later, is also very commonly used. Hope that made sense. Linens and cottons, lots and lots of linens and cottons for applique. Silks and silk velvets, especially late period, lots and lots and lots of silks and silk velvets. This one actually always amazes me because it almost doesn't look like it could be applique. It is applique, it has couching. The couching is actually almost exactly the same color as the silk. Just making it totally blend in together. Lots and lots of leather, to the degree that there is an example that you will find in Janet Arnold's book for those of you that own that, or you can ask your sewing friends, somebody will own it. There is an example in Janet Arnold's book that is leather applique done as so that it almost looked like it's a brocade. It is leather applique on silk done in like a pattern. It is amazing. And I can't find a free use pattern or picture of it. Otherwise, I would share it with you guys. Okay. So that's the, hey, let's get excited about applique part of this class. In the Facebook group that I was telling you guys about, I have uploaded these documents, and once I put this slideshow there, you can go there as well. And I have a document for wool on wool applique. I have a document for linen on linen applique. I have a document for wool Intarsia applique, and I have a document for leather applique. That is extremely picture rich. So we're going to start with the wool on wool applique one, because I want to talk a bit about how I work, and the wool on wool applique is the easier one. Firstly, for my wool, I go to thrift stores and I buy wool jackets. This was one haul, and it is jackets and a skirt that I found at the thrift store and then took apart. And if you look at them, you can actually see where the seams were of them. And you get them in a wide range of colors. And if you do it right, and you go when they're on sale and everything, you can get them for like $5 each. But make sure that you look for the wool mark and the actual tag that says, oh, this is 100% wool. For difficult to find colors, I often go for 80-20 as well. But I literally found like 4 of the paper size boxes full of them, full of wool fabric for like $100, and I have been using them forever. It took me a while to break them down into usable pieces, but they definitely is, it's the cheaper way to do this. Now, what you want to look out for, I'm going to just stop sharing for 1 second and you can look at me. What I have here is 2 wool pieces. What you want to be very careful when you look at these wool pieces is that this one is not very felted. And you can see it's not very felted because you can see all the different threads, and the threads actually come out fairly easily. The other piece I have here is very well felted, and I can actually pull and pull on this edge and nothing comes off. If you're going to do wool applique, you want the felted stuff. You want the stuff that isn't going to fray anymore. And this is where buying secondhand clothing is so good, because it's been worn, it's been washed, and it has got that extra layer of felting already happening. So you want to definitely look for stuff that is well felted. So though it's woven, it isn't just felt, it then is felted. Okay, now I can go back to share my screen. Where was I? Okay, so when so to do my stuff, I took my 3 pieces. I decided on what colors I was going to use. Wool come in a lot of different thicknesses. When you're doing applied applique, it doesn't matter. When you're doing Intarsia applique, you want to match the thicknesses as closely as possible. This is actually wool yarn, not my kitchen twine I usually use, that is available from all your knitting friends that always have little balls left over from the ends of their projects. So this is what you're going to need. I personally, when I was doing this design, the flames is a common theme in the heraldry for my barony. So making stuff with flames always will get used. So I just drew a design with flames and then cut it out with my cheap paper scissors, not my nice fabric scissors. You have to cut out each of the little pieces that you're going to use. So you're going to have to make the design a few times to get all the little pieces. Then you literally just pin it onto your fabric and cut right along the edge. You do not need to leave any type of seam allowance or anything. You can cut it right to the edge. Then you have all your little bits and pieces cut out. And next, you just stick them on top of each other. When you're working on big projects, this is actually a problem because wool will naturally bind a little bit with each other. And sometimes especially when I'm trying to attach like a long strip along the edge, it doesn't want to move where I want it to move. It just want to bind together, which is great when, once you start working, but sometimes you really have to fight it a bit to fight it into place. I have my little design. I pin it just a tiny little bit because, you are going to knock it and it is going to move. Sometimes we know that glue was extensively used, and if you're working with something and you are having problems, starch actually works really well as well to make stuff stick together. So if you spray it with starch and then put it down, the starch actually acts like a glue as well. And the advantage is the starch will just wash right back out again. So if you don't want glue that is going to stay there, starch is very useful to use. And usually with wool, you don't have to bother with that. I make double work for myself. If you look at this little example here, you will see there's only one set of stitches where the couching thread has been lost. So we know that in period, they often just use the couching to just sew it down as well. There are also examples, because as I said, there's as many exceptions as rules. So there are also examples where there are two pieces of, two sets of stitching, so that they stitch it down first and then they did the couching. Personally, I like it to stitch it down first and then do the couching, just because I have stuff that are 15 years old that still looks great. Because when I did it originally, I took the time to really sew it down. Okay, so I make tiny, tiny little stitches. If you go onto the museum website and look at this, you will see that this that looks like it is about the right size on your screen right now is actually not. This little fragment is actually 26 centimeters wide. That is almost the size of a ruler. So it is about twice as wide as you are seeing it on your screen right now, depending on, the screen you're using. If you're looking at a computer screen, if you're looking at this on your big screen TV, no. But if you're looking at a computer screen, it is almost the size of a ruler. So if we look at the stitches, then you will see that these stitches are almost like a quarter of an inch away from each other. They are much, much wider spaced than what I usually do when I work. I like to put them really, really close together, but I always feel obliged to tell people that that is not how it was often done in period. In period, it was quite often done with the stitches quite a distance away from each other. And because we're working with wool here, we don't have it won't be hopefully fraying very much. Okay, but I don't. I work very, very close together. I always hide my ends in between the fabric. I hide the ends of my sewing between the fabric, and I hide the ends of my couching in between the fabric. And that also is the period way to do it, because if you look at this couching, you can't see the little ends of it. The ends of it is either behind the piece, or it's in between the two pieces of fabric. So the advantage with that is that it's less likely to pull loose because it's hidden in there, and the edges is less likely to fray. And once cording starts fraying, you can kind of lose it really badly. Okay, so that's what I do. I make my little stitches and I sew all the way around, and all the way around all of them. Then I take my couching cord, and like I said, I put it on a big needle and I actually pull it. I haven't pulled it all the way through yet. That's why the tail is still sticking out here. But what I will do is I will pull it so that the end of the tail is actually in between the fabrics, so that it's protected there, and everything binds together nicely. And then I sew the little couching cord down. I literally start again, and I make little stitches. And as I said, you have two options at this point. You can either work perpendicular with the couching, or you can work with the twist. As you can see, this will actually have a very definite twist. So you could actually sew with that twist, and it would hide your stitches really, really well. Okay, so that's the next step. Here is it from the back. You can see where I have doubled up the stitching there for the color. Sometimes I find, I'm trying to just give all the hints of stuff that I've learned. Sometimes I find when it's the edge is very complicated, that it's almost easier to make the stitch, then pull the couching cord tight, and then tighten up the stitch that you've made, and it pulls it into space, into position like that, rather than trying to make it lie where you want it to lie and try to guess where the edge is. You just make the stitch loosely, and then use the stitch that you made to pull the couching cord into position. Okay, where are we? Here we are. I have finished my second couching piece, and once again I put my yarn onto my big needle, and I am going to hide that end in between the two pieces of fabric to make it clearly hidden. And that's it. That is how you do wool on wool applique, and it is the easiest thing in the world. And then you just do it like a million more times. And it really is very visually impactful, because you can work fairly big areas fairly quickly. And as you can see, it's very period appropriate. They definitely used it for a lot of different applications. Okay, so we have enough time that I can show you much more difficult stuff. So as I said, I also have a how-to page on doing linen on linen applique. And linen on linen applique is way more difficult than wool on wool applique. So I'm gonna miss out on a lot of stuff. I have found, once again, I have my little design, and I have found my colors that I'm going to use. Once again, scraps. These scraps are all from clothing that I've made. If you have seamstress friends, a lot of them will not throw away their scraps, because we're all like that, and you can often beg difficult colors off them. So once again, I cut out my design until I have my 3 templates of what I'm going to be using.
Benika, can I sneak in with a question?
Yes.
Pamela asks, to apply the pieces before couching, did you use a whip stitch or running stitch?
Whip stitch. Whip stitch. The only examples that I found for the running stitch is for the leather. For everything else, it's always whip stitches. I like, for me, it's almost like I often use almost like a hemming stitch, so that it is a stitch that is parallel to the edge. Parallel, I keep saying that, perpendicular to the edge, with the diagonal on the back. And one of the reasons why you want to do a hem or a whip stitch is that it pulls the edges down. If you do a running stitch, you have to work like a little bit off the edge, and it actually pushes the edges up. So with the whip stitch, because you're sewing across the edges, it pulls the edges down, and there's less chance that they will wear, and that they will, get stuck on stuff or anything. You really want to do what you can to get that edges nice and neatly, tightly tucked in. Okay, so here, when I'm working in linen, I have to have a hem allowance. So I can make my template with a hem allowance, but I generally don't. What I do is I will pin it to allow myself enough space to cut it with a hem allowance. So here you can see the black is cut with a allowance around it. So is the yellow, so is the red. You will see, especially here with the yellow, that I haven't cut yet all the way into the little nooks and crannies. The reason I do that is that, especially if you have smaller ones, it'll start to fray straight away. So by not cutting it and waiting till I'm actually working with it to cut it, I I don't get the same level of fray. It doesn't fray as much. Okay, now I am actually working on a project that I have done. It is a canopy that has these little dags that hang down, and each of the dags is a totally different technique of how to work the linen on linen applique. Some of them are just tweaks, some of them are vastly different. And I think I'm at number 23. There is so many different ways that you can do linen on linen applique. The reason that I'm showing you, the one that I'm showing you, is because even if you are not an experienced seamstress and not an experienced sewer, this method means that you can actually do linen on linen applique. It is long, it is involved, it's going to take you quite some time to get it done. And once you've done it once or twice, you're going to start skipping some of the steps that I'm going to tell you here. However, I would rather start at doing it the most involved way possible, and then you later learning how to miss out steps, than to show you how to do all the shortcuts and then you can't do it because you're still starting to learn how stuff work together. So the method I'm showing here is similar to English paper piecing when you're doing a quilt. You are actually basting the seam allowance or the hem allowance to the paper. So as you can see here, I have literally started and I chose a color that is not at all the color that I'm using with. And I have started sewing a basting stitch, basting the linen to the paper. And that is what I'm going to continue doing, basting the linen to the paper, sewing through both layers of linen and the paper. Nice big stitches. When you are going around the curve, you want to kind of not make sharp edges. You want to ease rather than fold to make it like follow the little curve. And you can see it very clearly here where it's just eased around that curve. So where am I here? You will keep going and easing around the curve. And you can see that only at this point did I actually cut the rest of my fabric. I cut all the way in, and because fabric can't become more than it is, I have cut these little snips on the inside curve so that once I go around this corner, and you can see here how I have folded the corner and basted it down, this little snips allow me to go around the inside curve, still basting the fabric onto the paper. And here I am showing it to you from the good side. This is the side that you're going to eventually see. And you can see the big basting stitches as I am working my way around the object and literally sewing my fabric to my paper. And since I've gotten to this bit, you can see I've now cut down this little valley here as well. And since next I'm going to be basting that down. If you do have a lot of trouble, once again, starch is just a marvelous thing. I like literally have like a can of spray starch that I use a lot. If you spray starch linen, it's more like, it becomes almost like paper, and it's much easier to fold, and it'll keep the fold, but it also won't fray. And that's the main thing. You know, you're working with quite small bits, so it's very likely that the small bits will start fraying on you. Okay, continuing on, and I've done the yellow one, like finished the yellow one there, and now I'm working on the red one. And once again, you can see here how I'm like easing it around the curve rather than making sharp points. Oh, and on that note, where was that? Not that, this one. You can see here that when I was making this point, I had like a lot of extra fabric that I have cut off. And you know, you are going to end up with several layers there in any case, but you kind of want to trim as you go away the really, really bulky pieces of fabric that you end up with. So I am done now. I have sewn my 2 pieces of linen in my colors that I want onto my 2 pieces of fabric. Okay, next I get out my trusty iron and I squish everything down, and I make sure that it is going to stay where I left it, because when you iron it, you reinforce the fold, and that means that even when it even when you move stuff, it's always going to go back to where you had ironed it folded. And that is going to make your life easier in a while. So next, I'm actually going to sew my stuff together. Once again, I always try to start and end in between the layers. So here you can see I've, did a few starting stitches that's going to be covered up by the fabric that I'm going to sew down. Then I sew all along the edge with a little whip stitch. And here, to make your life easier for yourself, you want to make a really little whip stitch. You literally only want to catch like 2 or 3 threads of the linen that you're, like the top layer of linen that you're sewing down. And you're going to want to try to actually not sew through the paper. So you're sewing right, as you can see there, you're sewing like right at the little edge there. Okay. Where are we? Now, once again, I do much tighter stitches than would have been done in period. This little fragment is about 13 centimeters wide. So it's actually pretty close to this size. It's, depending on the size of your computer screen. I'm sorry, I'm from South Africa, and I think in centimeters, and then I'm like, darn, I should have done that in inches. But you can see here how few stitches they've actually made. You can see there's like a stitch there, a stitch there, a stitch there, a stitch there. And some of these stitches, even on this linen, is like a quarter of an inch away from each other. They did not, I would have, if this was me sewing where they have 4 stitches, I would have had like 20 stitches. I sew very tightly because then it lasts, but I always feel like morally obliged to tell people that that is not how they did it in period. And clearly, even sewing it that far apart works, because here we are hundreds of years later and this still exists, and it actually still looks pretty good. It hasn't totally the little applique bit hasn't totally fallen apart. There's bits where the underlying fabric is pulling out a little bit, but it's actually still in a pretty good condition. Okay, so here's a bit blurry but clear stitch of how I do my stitch. As you can see, I catch a tiny little bit of fabric. The diagonal goes around the back and comes out again, just catching a tiny, tiny little bit of fabric. Here's a photo from the back where you can see how tight my stitches are compared to what they did in period. I work fairly tightly, small stitches, and then even smaller stitches when I go around curves and do weird bits and stuff. Okay, so now I've finished sewing, and I stop my sewing about an inch from where I started my sewing. And I should have said this from the start, but usually when you start your sewing, you want to try to see if you can find a spot that's fairly straight. So for my design, probably the straightest spot is right here. So I'm going to stop about an inch away from where I started on like the straight bit of it. Next, what I'm going to do is I am going to use my trusty seam ripper, of which I have like 50 in my house because they live happy lives without me under couches and hidden behind spaces. And I am going to take out not my sewing stitches, but the huge big basting stitches that I made to start with. So I'm going to pull out all these huge big basting stitches. Oh, I have to speed up. Time's up. Okay, so I have taken out all the big basting stitches, and my next step is going to be where I left this inch open. I'm going to pull out the paper because I don't want the paper to stay there. Because I haven't sewn through the paper, I can actually gently ease the paper out from in between the layers. And then invariably it doesn't. You end up with one of the little corners that's got stayed behind, at which point I pull out my trusty pliers and I dig out those little corners as well. You want to get all the paper out in between there. And then this is why you iron, because now that edge where you have the inch is going to naturally fold back under again, and then you can sew down that inch again, and then sew the next one right on top of it. So I'm doing exactly the same thing with the next layer. People often ask me, should I not sew the red to the yellow and then the yellow to the black? You can't, because when you have to get the paper out of the yellow before you can sew the red. Otherwise, you're going to sew through the paper in the yellow and then never get that paper out again. So you're building it up in layers going upward. And once again, I'm going to leave my inch, and I am going to pull out my little piece of paper that, of course, never comes out in one piece. I think you do it wrong when it all comes out in one piece. And here you can see that when I was sewing, I actually sewed the red all the way down to the black. And the reason for this is that when you have bigger, on this layer, on this scale, it doesn't matter. But with bigger pieces, when you have big open things, they will like balloon and go crazy. But with this, it's actually quilted the middle of the yellow one down. And it just means that everything is binds together much better, and it's less likely to deform and bulge. And that's it. This is a really nice complex design that was done, that could be done with that exact same method. Okay, and that's it. I thank you all for coming. All this information will be made available for you, both the original slideshow as well as these detailed slideshows, because I like having these detailed slideshows and being able to work through them slide by slide. Okay, any questions?